I met Blake when I was 22, fresh off a string of disappointing relationships with guys who couldn't handle an independent woman making her own money. My friend Jessica introduced us at some barbecue, and honestly, I wasn't impressed at first glance. He was this clean-cut welder type, all work boots and earnest handshakes, talking about his career goals like he was planning to cure cancer instead of just joining metal together. But then Jessica mentioned he was already making six figures at 21. And suddenly his boring little stories about trade school became a lot more interesting. What really caught my attention was watching him interact with other women that night. This girl, Melissa, was practically throwing herself at him, doing that whole giggly, touchy thing, and he just politely excused himself and walked away. Later, I overheard him telling his buddy that he wasn't interested because she seemed like drama. That's when I realized Blake wasn't like the other guys I'd been wasting time with. He had standards, money, and apparently the self-control to stick to his principles. Perfect. I've been doing adult content for about 3 years by then. Ever since college got too expensive and regular jobs couldn't cover my lifestyle. It started small, just some photos here and there, but the money was incredible and the work was easy. Why would I break my back at some minimum wage job when I could make more in a weekend than most people made in a month? The problem was that most guys either got weird and possessive about it, or they wanted to pimp me out to their friends. Blake was different. I could tell from the way he talked about wanting a real relationship and a traditional wife that he'd never be okay with what I did. But that was fine. I could work with traditional, so I crafted my approach carefully. I started showing up to the same places I knew he'd be, always dressed just conservatively enough to catch his attention without looking like I was trying too hard. When we finally talked one-on-one, I let him do most of the talking while I played the interested, wholesome girl next door. He told me about his dad teaching him the value of hard work, about wanting to build something real with the right person, about how he was tired of women who just wanted to party and hook up. I nodded along, making all the right sympathetic noises, thinking about how perfectly I could fit into that fantasy. The virgin thing wasn't even planned initially. It just came up naturally when he mentioned how he respected women who saved themselves for someone special. I could practically see his pupils dilate when I blushed and admitted I was waiting for the right person. The way his whole demeanor changed, how protective and reverent he became. I knew I'd struck gold. Here was a guy who would literally worship me for something I could easily fake, and he had the bank account to show his appreciation properly. Maintaining the act during our year of dating was almost fun, like an extended performance piece. I'd schedule all my content creation around his work schedule and our dates, telling him I was building a makeup consulting business that required a lot of evening video calls with clients. He was so supportive, always asking how the business was going, even offering to help with marketing. It was adorable. Really, how eager he was to support his entrepreneurial girlfriend while having no clue what I was actually selling. The close calls made it exciting. He'd come over unexpectedly, and I'd have to quickly hide my ring lights and camera equipment, claiming I was just testing some new products. Or he'd see notifications on my phone from other creators, and I'd brush them off as networking with other business owners. Blake was smart enough to be successful, but apparently not smart enough to ask the right questions. He saw what he wanted to see, which made my job incredibly easy. When he proposed after exactly 1 year of dating, I almost laughed at how predictable it was. He'd planned this whole romantic dinner, got down on one knee with a ring that probably cost him 3 months' salary, and gave me this speech about building a life together based on trust and shared values. I said yes with tears in my eyes, though they weren't from joy. They were from relief, financial security, social respectability, and a husband who adored me enough to never look too closely at what I was doing. I'd won. The 3-month engagement was a whirlwind of playing the blushing bride-to-be. Blake wanted a small ceremony, just close friends and family, which was perfect since I'd been lying about most of my background anyway. I told him my parents were very private people who couldn't make it due to my father's health issues. In reality, I hadn't spoken to them in years because they'd cut me off when they found out about my career choices. But Blake didn't need to know that. He just saw a sweet girl who was sadly estranged from her family and needed him to be her whole world. Our wedding night was the first real test of my performance skills. Blake was so gentle, so reverent, treating me like I was made of spun glass. When he noticed I wasn't exactly what he expected physically, I fed him some story about breaking my hymen during yoga, and he believed it completely because he wanted to. That's the thing about men like Blake. They're so invested in their fantasy that they'll accept any explanation that lets them keep believing in it. The first month of marriage was when I got sloppy. Having that ring on my finger made me feel invincible, like I'd crossed some finish line and could relax my guard. Blake was working long hours on some big project, leaving early and coming home exhausted, which gave me plenty of time to set up my home office properly. I told him I was expanding the makeup business into video tutorials, which explained the professional lighting setup and camera equipment that suddenly appeared in our spare room. The money was better than ever. Married women were apparently a popular niche, and I played up the naughty housewife angle without Blake having any clue. I'd film content while he was at work, edit it during his evening showers, and upload everything after he went to sleep. The other girls in our group chat were impressed by how much I was pulling in while maintaining a completely separate married life. It felt like having my cake and eating it too. That's probably why I got careless with my phone. After weeks of Blake never questioning anything, never looking over my shoulder, never showing the slightest suspicion, I stopped being paranoid about hiding things. So when Jess texted me, that last video was fire. When's the next one dropping? I didn't think twice about leaving my phone unlocked on the kitchen counter while I went to grab something from the bedroom. I came back to find Blake standing there, staring at my phone screen with this expression I'd never seen before. Not angry? Exactly, but completely still in a way that made my stomach drop. He looked up at me and asked, very quietly, "What video is she talking about?" "Samantha?" My brain kicked into damage control mode immediately. "Oh, that's about the makeup tutorial I posted last week. You know how dramatic Jess gets about everything." But even as I said it, I could see it wasn't working. Blake's eyes had gone flat and cold, and he was scrolling through my messages with the methodical patience of someone who already knew what they were going to find. "Samantha," he said, still in that terrifyingly calm voice. "What is this group chat called Content Queens, and why are you in it?" That's when I knew I was screwed. The group chat was where all of us adult content creators shared tips, promoted each other's work, and complained about difficult clients. There was no innocent explanation for the conversations in there, especially not the recent ones, where I'd been bragging about my clueless husband bankrolling my lifestyle while I made more money than him behind his back. I watched Blake read through months of messages, his face getting more and more expressionless with each screenshot. When he finally looked up at me, I felt like a butterfly pinned to a board. "So," he said, setting my phone down carefully on the counter, "how long were you planning to keep this up?" I tried everything. Tears, explanations, justifications. I didn't want you to judge me. I really was trying to leave that behind. But the money was good. I didn't know how to tell you. It was all true. In a way, I had thought about quitting, especially in those first few weeks when Blake was so happy and grateful and loving. But the money really was incredible. And it seemed so harmless, since he never found out. But Blake just stood there, listening to my explanations with that same dead expression. And when I finally ran out of words, he said the 4 words that destroyed everything. I want a divorce. I couldn't believe he was serious. Over some photos and videos, I was still the same person he'd fallen in love with. Still the same woman who cooked his dinners and shared his bed and supported his dreams. So what if I hadn't told him every detail about my income sources? Most wives kept some things private. It wasn't like I was cheating on him with actual people. But Blake wasn't interested in hearing any of that. He moved out that same night, staying with a friend while I sat alone in our apartment, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so fast. I kept expecting him to come back, to calm down and realize he was overreacting. But instead I got served with divorce papers a week later. The divorce itself was humiliatingly quick. Since we'd only been married a month and had kept our finances mostly separate, there wasn't much to divide. Blake didn't want anything except out, and his lawyer made it clear that fighting would only drag things out and cost money I didn't have. Because that was the other problem. Without Blake's income, I couldn't afford our apartment, and my parents had made it clear years ago that I wasn't welcome back home. I ended up couch surfing with various friends from the industry, trying to rebuild my content creation business while dealing with the emotional aftermath of my marriage imploding. It was during this period, when I was feeling particularly low and vulnerable, that I met Marcus at a bar. He was charming, attentive, and completely different from Blake's earnest stability. Where Blake had been careful and respectful, Marcus was exciting and spontaneous. Where Blake had wanted to build something lasting, Marcus lived entirely in the moment. Our relationship was intense but chaotic. Marcus claimed to be between jobs but always had money for drinks and dinners and weekend trips. He said he was working on some big business deal that would set us both up for life. But the details were always vague. I was so grateful to have someone who accepted my work without judgment, who actually seemed excited by it, that I ignored all the obvious red flags. When I told Marcus I was pregnant after 3 months together, his reaction should have told me everything I needed to know. Instead of excitement or even concern, he went completely silent for a long moment before asking if I was sure it was his. That question should have ended things right there. But I was so desperate not to be alone that I convinced myself he was just shocked and needed time to process. He disappeared 2 days later. No goodbye, no explanation. just gone. His phone went straight to voicemail. His social media accounts were deleted. And when I went to his apartment, the landlord told me he'd broken his lease and moved out overnight. I never saw or heard from him again. So there I was, pregnant and alone, staying on friends' couches and trying to figure out what to do next. My content creation income had dropped significantly during the chaos of my divorce and relationship with Marcus, and pregnancy was making it harder to maintain the energy and appearance the work required. I was facing the reality of being a single mother with no stable income, no family support, and no real plan. That's when I thought about Blake. He'd always been responsible, always been the type to do the right thing. We'd been married, even if briefly, and he'd claimed to love me. Surely he wouldn't just abandon me when I was in such a desperate situation. Maybe enough time had passed for him to forgive me, to see that what I'd done wasn't really that terrible in the grand scheme of things. It took me weeks to work up the courage to go to his apartment. I knew he'd changed the locks, so I couldn't just let myself in like I used to, but I thought if he saw me in person, saw how pregnant and vulnerable I was, his protective instincts would kick in. Blake had always been a rescuer at heart. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, his face went through about 5 different expressions before settling on resignation. He looked good, better than he had when we were married. Actually, healthier, more relaxed, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. It stung more than I wanted to admit. "What do you want, Samantha?" he asked, not moving to let me inside. I gave him my most pitiful look, one hand on my obviously pregnant belly. "Can I please just come inside? I walked here and it's so hot outside." It was July, blazingly hot, and I was visibly sweating and uncomfortable. What kind of man would leave a pregnant woman standing in that heat? But Blake just stood there in the doorway, unmoved. "We can talk right here. What do you want?" So I had to explain the whole situation there in the hallway, where any of his neighbors could hear. How Marcus had left me, how I was struggling financially, how I needed somewhere stable to stay until the baby came. I offered to help with rent, to contribute however I could. I even, in a moment of desperation, suggested we could pick up where we left off physically, if that would sweeten the deal. Blake's expression got even colder at that. "No, Samantha, you can't stay here. You need to leave." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're going to let a pregnant woman suffer in this heat. What kind of man are you?" I was genuinely shocked by his callousness. The Blake I'd married would never have been so heartless. "The kind of man who learns from his mistakes," he said. "You need to go." That's when I lost my temper and made my biggest mistake. "Fine," I snapped. "But when I call the police and tell them you're harassing a pregnant woman, don't act surprised." Blake actually smiled at that, which was somehow more terrifying than if he'd gotten angry. "Cool," he said, pulling out his phone. "Let's call them together right now. I'd love to have them hear about how my ex-wife is trying to extort me." I left without another word because I knew he wasn't bluffing. The Blake I'd married might have been naive, but this version was clearly done with my manipulation tactics. The next few months were the hardest of my life. I eventually found a small apartment I could barely afford, working as much as I could while pregnant and dealing with all the physical and emotional challenges that came with it. When Lily was born, I was completely on my own. No family, no partner, no support system, beyond a few acquaintances from work who sent congratulations texts but didn't offer any real help. Marcus never reappeared, never even acknowledged that he had a daughter. I tried tracking him down through mutual friends, but it was like he'd vanished completely. Apparently, disappearing when things got complicated was just his standard operating procedure. By the time Lily was 6 months old, I was desperate enough to return to content creation full-time. It wasn't ideal working from home with a baby, but it was the only income source I had that offered enough flexibility and earning potential to support us both. The other girls in the group chat were supportive, sharing tips for working around childcare schedules and dealing with the physical changes that came with pregnancy and motherhood. It was through that group chat that I learned Blake had found out about my return to the industry. Apparently, one of his friends had come across my content and sent him the link, thinking he should know. I felt violated by that, like my privacy had been invaded, even though I was literally posting content for public consumption. It was the principle of the thing. What really bothered me was hearing through mutual acquaintances that Blake seemed to be doing great. He'd gotten some big job opportunity in North Dakota, was planning to buy land and build a house, had completely moved on with his life, like our marriage had never happened. Meanwhile, I was struggling to make ends meet as a single mother, dealing with all the judgment and complications that came with my work situation. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Blake had just been more understanding, more willing to work through our problems instead of immediately jumping to divorce. If he'd been the kind of husband who could accept all aspects of his wife's life, None of this would have happened. Lily would have a father. I'd have financial security, and we'd probably be living in some nice house talking about having more kids. But Blake was too rigid, too judgmental to see past his own narrow worldview. He claimed to love me, but apparently that love came with conditions and requirements that he'd never bothered to mention during our entire courtship. How was I supposed to know that my career would be such a deal breaker when he'd never asked the right questions to begin with? Now I'm 26, raising a daughter alone while trying to maintain a career that gets more complicated every year. Lily is starting to ask questions about why she doesn't have a daddy like other kids, and I don't know what to tell her. How do you explain that her father was a coward who ran away, and her stepfather was too selfish to step up when we needed him? The worst part is that I know Blake is out there living his best life, probably telling people about his crazy ex-wife who lied to him, painting himself as the victim in our story. He gets to be the wronged party, the man who escaped a deceptive woman, while I'm left dealing with all the real consequences of our relationship ending. But I'm managing. Lily is healthy and happy. My work is steady, even if it's not ideal. And I'm building the kind of independent life that doesn't rely on anyone else's approval or support. Maybe that's better in the long run. At least I know I can count on myself, which is more than I can say for any of the men who've been in my life. Sometimes I think about reaching out to Blake again, maybe when enough time has passed for him to gain some perspective on what really matters. But then I remember how cold and unmoved he was when I needed help the most. And I realize that ship has probably sailed. He made his choice, just like I made mine. And now we both have to live with the consequences. I just hope that someday, when Lily is older and can understand these things better, she'll see that I did everything I could to provide for her and give her a good life, even when circumstances weren't ideal. That's what being a mother really means, doing whatever it takes to take care of your child, regardless of what other people think about your choices.